Okay, I can see some more people joining, but it's time to start. Thank you very much again. Welcome, everybody. Such an honor to host this session with an esteemed panel, which I'll introduce in a minute. I'm Harjeet Singh, Head of Global Political Strategy at Climate Action Network International. Um, Let me start with a brief logistics. Um, it's going to be a 90-minute session in a webinar mode. We will hear from the panelists on the IPCC findings and how we are going to influence the policymakers. Then we will have 30 minutes plus for the discussion. You can put your questions in the Q&A section. And if you find it difficult, you can post it in the chat. Our colleagues from Climate Action Network are going to pick up your questions, and then we can have a conversation. We'll respond to your questions. Let me first start with introductions. So very honored to have Professor Otto Poertner. He's the co-chair of IPCC Working Group 2, which you know is on adaptation and climate impacts. He's the co-author of the IPCC synthesis report as well, and of course, summary for policymakers. He is also coordinating lead author of Chapter 6, which is on ocean systems of the Working Group 2, a contribution to IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. And he has also been co-chair of the Working Group 2 on impacts and adaptation of the IPCC since 2014. So he's a physiologist and marine biologist performing research at the Alfred Wegener Institute Center, Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research. And such an honor to have you, Hans. We also have Professor James Skea. He likes to be called Jim. He's co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3, that's on mitigation, as you know, co-author of the IPCC synthesis report and summary for policymakers, and co-chair of the Working Group 3 of the IPCC since 2004, like Hans, and professor of sustainable energy at the Imperial College London, with research interests in energy, climate change, and technological innovation, and a lot more. And we'll talk about it, when he gets to the question answer session. We also have Lili Fuhr. She is the deputy director of CIEL, Climate and Energy Program. In that role, Lili helps to lead a team of dedicated attorneys and campaigners working to transform our energy system, to urgently address the political, social, and economic realities of the climate crisis. We also have Dr. Stephan, who is with Climate Action Network as Senior Advisor, Climate Science and Global Energy Policy. Last but not the least, Tasneem Essop, our Executive Director of Climate Action Network International. So that's the panel. And just a bit from me to get us started. As you all know, that IPCC Assessment Report 6 is the most authoritative report. It represents the work of thousands of scientists that started in 2016. So the report has come after, so the last report was released in 2014. There were working reports that have been coming out. In fact, 6 reports we have seen in the last few years. And this synthesis report, it's new because it really connects the dots, bringing analysis from those 6 reports, but particularly closing the loop, because the first report, as you remember, was on 1.5 degrees science report in 2018, and then now getting the world together to talk about how we can stay below 1.5 degree, what are the dangers, and it's very clear that the world cannot afford to breach that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. It is a survival target. It has to become the linchpin of all our actions. And when you read that report and summary for policymakers, you'll be amazed to see it's not only overarching, it not only provides the scientific context, but also tells us what is the direction of travel. And the details it offers is a clear message to policymakers what they have to do. While it delivers a stark warning to the world and especially to the policymakers where we are, and telling us that how we have a narrow window to avert catastrophic climate change. So this is such a landmark report. And the reality is that we are now at a crossroads. What we do or don't do in the next few years will determine our future, as IPCC very clearly says, not just for hundreds, even thousands of years. So that's where we are. I'll not take much time. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Stephan Singh, my colleague from Climate Action Network. He's just going to provide a brief context, and then we'll hear from Hans and Jim. Over to you, Stephan.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to work with the IPCC. It's always very enlightening. Sophistication and science comes across, and it's not always easy, but I'm not getting into that one. I will talk a little bit about what is our observations, or my observations in particular, on what I've observed in the last cycle of the IPCC AR6 reports, and then compiled in the Singh report. What is the gist? Of course, I cannot do justice to all issues, but what I think what the IPCC did was outstanding. And I think the IPCC has used words which are very sober, very humble, very careful, but we understand the meaning. First slide, please. The multidisciplinary IPCC effort has concluded unequivocally staying below 1.5C as a century objective, and Harjeet called a survival target, is necessary, doable, cheap, and has many co-benefits beyond climate. Indeed, during our observations in the various negotiations with governments and otherwise, I haven't come across, others might have, I haven't come across a serious argument why we would not be able to meet 1.5C. Of course, it's difficult, it's a challenge, and Herculean task, but I found always the ideas by most delegates, if I talk about governments, and by all scientists, yes, let's do it. And that is very inspiring. In fact, 1.5C, as we see it, is a death penalty for fossil fuels eventually as the main culprit of climate change, as the IPCC has clearly documented. Accepting the IPCC science also requires, and I know you're not policy prescriptive, you have to be policy neutral, but if you read this one, you know what it means. It requires massive efforts in adaptation, resilience building, and addressing loss and damage in a way which had never happened before. The report effectively urges much higher speed and scale of just transitions. If you understand what the word means, they don't say we urge that one, you know, they're not allowed to be prescriptive, but we can read the text. Adopting the principles of equity, justice, and solidarity, much more than seen today and in the past. 1.5C policies demand policies and interventions on all greenhouse gases, not only CO2, all economic, industrial, and land sectors globally, and speedily, while acknowledging that the rich countries have a much higher responsibility. That's very much bread and butter of the report. Yes, of course, we also assess correctly that there will be likely temporary overshoot in the early 2030s, temperature overshoot, even under deep decarbonization efforts. That is caused by the atmospheric carbon legacy and result of basically 40, 45 years of doing not as much as we should have done much earlier, and allowed for large enrichment of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is now with 420 ppm, probably the highest than 5 to 10 million years. Therefore, we need, besides deep emissions reductions, we need sustainable negative emissions, like immediate halt of ecosystem and forest destruction, as well as restoration of degraded ecosystems. And of course, and this is what we are saying, we need to be very careful and oppose false solutions, and Lili will talk about this later. Every increment of global warming will increase the risk of low probability and high impact events, as the IPCC has so brilliantly described irreversible natural system changes on biodiversity extinction, forest fires decline, as we observe already, sea level rise, exponential rise of sea level rise, droughts, and again, exponential, not linear, threat of extreme events like permanent polar ice melting, warm water coral extinction might threaten more and more with every increment of global warming. Embarking on a 1.5C trajectory, nevertheless, requires unprecedented and transformational changes in economic, social system, finances regulation, multilateral relations, cooperation within and among countries, as well as many other stakeholders like cities and businesses, etc. 1.5C is not a paradise. We have to do our utmost with all in the boat. Everyone needs to have hands on decks in line with equity and the just transition. But however, outstanding, and as an umbrella issue, is the currency is political will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephan, for such sharp and clear messages and how we see what is really coming out in terms of overarching. I'm now going to invite Hans Otto to share the work around Working Group 2. As you know, he is the co-chair of the Working Group 2. And I must also mention such an amazing leadership that you have shown to really bring up the issues of climate impacts. We know, for the last several years and decades, the focus has been much more on mitigation, and rightly so. But in the last few years, as we see impacts increasing, it was so important to bring that issue which is so real for people and ecosystems and what needs to be done. So over to you, Hans, to share what has come out from the IPCC report.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks a lot for your kind introduction. And as you've said, I will be talking about impacts that we have already observed and also addressing the risks that are ahead of us and how we could actually deal with those risks. As already indicated, we are building on a set of reports during this cycle, and the synthesis report is trying to bring the key insights together from all of these. There are the 3 working group reports, and there are the 3 special reports, and this has been the richest cycle in IPCC history in terms of effort and outcome, and also in terms of success, also in terms of the societal mobilization that the information coming out of these efforts has caused, especially starting essentially starting with the 1.5 report. And then there are the 2 others, the ocean and cryosphere reports and the climate change and land report that have added to the overarching insight this cycle has produced. Let me just start with a quick overview of what actually is happening in the climate system and is causing those impacts that are so concerning to us. And that is the increase in physical climate changes and extremes that are important to be mentioned here. And that's the increase in drought, the increase in fire weather, in compound flooding, in heavy precipitation, and at the same time we are losing important water resources like the glaciers that are buffering water supplies. And with the melting ice on this planet, there comes global sea level rise, which is challenging the coastlines and challenging the capacities to adapt. And the increase in hot extremes is also to be mentioned, not only on land, but also for the ocean. And one of the overarching, very certain challenges in the ocean is also ocean acidification, not to forget about the loss of oxygen from ocean waters. Now we are proceeding this century to surpass the threshold value that Stephan has already emphasize the 1.5 degrees Celsius if we do not take ambitious action. And the projections are here listed and shown according to very clear changes in global mean temperature from 1.5 to 2 to 3 and then to 4. And you see the globes underneath with respect to the temperature patterns across the continents and the ocean. And there is one very clear trend to be seen. The polar areas are especially affected by the warming trend, and then the continental masses, the temperatures over land, are increasing much more than they are increasing for the ocean. So the global mean value that has both components included is usually less than the warming we see over land, and in many places we have already surpassed the 1.5 degrees that have become such a symbolic number for climate change based on the 1.5 report. Another important impact that I just show as an example is soil moisture. Although with the intensifying hydrological cycle, we are seeing an intensification of precipitation and also water content in the atmosphere. In many places, we are actually seeing impoverishment of water supplies. And the brownish areas on this slide here show where the places where actually water deficiency is reflected in declining soil moisture. And there are special places in North America, South America, for Europe and Africa. It's the Mediterranean region and South Africa that are especially severely affected, and these impacts are increasing with the degree of global warming. And you also see these impacts in Asia, in East Asia, in some places there as well. And what we have already experienced in terms of climate change has caused a widespread and substantial impacts and related losses and damages that can be attributed to climate change. And this is essentially a little list of the different systems and sectors and processes that are being affected. It concerns water availability and food production, human health and well-being, also including mental health. It concerns infrastructure, settlements and cities, and last not least, it concerns the biodiversity and ecosystems in many regions. An overarching conclusion, and the confidence in those findings is actually usually quite high. And an overarching conclusion is that no sector and system essentially remains untouched, and that impacts will be more severe in the future, and certainly the negative impacts are outweighing those positive changes that may occur here and there due to climate change. A very symbolic figure that the synthesis report has produced is this one, where the stripes here show the degree of warming as it has evolved over the last century, and with the beginning of this one, and the future, the different futures that are ahead of us during this century. And it is very telling if you consider where you are yourself with respect to your personal age and where future generations will be taken. And essentially, who is born today will see the end of the century and will experience the result of the decisions that we and humankind overall are making today. So the conclusion really is what we do now defines the future of humankind and the planet. We are living in a crucial period of human evolutionary history, because certainly with respect to the impacts and risks seen, it is very concerning what climate change is bringing for our species and for other species as well. Let's talk about the other species a bit. and talk about different regions and what we see depending on the degree of global warming, again reflected here in the global mean temperature. And the brownish areas that you are seeing here is indicative of the percent changes of those regions where environmental conditions move outside of the niche of a species, essentially indicating where places could become uninhabitable for the species that have traditionally been living there. And this expansion of those areas is starting with 1.5, moving on to 2 and 3, and it goes across the land and the ocean. And essentially, a general trend is that the lower latitudes may become uninhabitable for animals, which is what this analysis has mainly addressed, about 30-some thousand species of animals, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish, invertebrates in the sea, and so forth, and including only a small group of plants in the analysis. There is obviously a trend with climate change, and this is something that we have already seen and can also see in the fossil record for Earth's history, that in similar ways as in evolutionary crisis during Earth's history, there is a loss of habitat, especially in the low latitudes. Higher life forms, such as animals that have typically lower temperature thresholds than the lower life forms, do not find suitable habitat there anymore and retreat from the tropics, move to higher latitudes. And we are just part of this. We are part of the animal kingdom. There is an impact on the human species as well. And for us, the temperature, like for any mammal, the temperature thresholds and tolerances are defined by the combination of heat and humidity, humidity defining to what extent we are able to regulate our body's temperature through sweating and evaporation. And this is showing that already we are seeing places where the environmental conditions are challenging for humans to be outside, and the number of days where this is the case is going to increase in the future. And again, it's the lower latitudes that are being impacted. We are already, this analysis does not include extreme events, and it does not include technical adaptation measures. It just shows where the outside becomes hostile for our species to exist, and where actually such impacts also reflect the loss of habitat, this time for our species, unless we find technological means to secure our existence in those places. You can imagine the consequences that are coming from this. And let me emphasize, not just because of heat, but because of all the other challenges that I have listed. 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are living in places where they display high vulnerability to climate change. And these concerns large parts of Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, small islands, and the Arctic. And this also includes the capacity for us to have food available. Food production impacts are increasing. And here you see this for two sectors, for the yield of maize and for fisheries. And you see that the purple areas here, where the percentage of negative impacts is increasing, that is this again concerns mostly the lower latitudes. And for the fisheries, it's again also the lower latitudes, and in some higher latitudes areas there may actually be an increase in fisheries results, at least transiently. So the places, especially where developing countries depend on such food productivity, are negatively impacted. Overall, a conclusion must be that food security is at stake with progressive climate change. We have analyzed risks And we have tried to quantify those risks in relation to the environmental changes mirrored in global mean temperatures. And we are doing this in the form of burning ember diagrams, where we go from white undetectable to moderate yellow to high red and to very high purple. And this is showing you the narrow bands, the assessment done in 2014 for the last synthesis report, and the analysis that is now available from the assessment across all the 6 reports we've shown we have shown you in the beginning. And here you see how the risk develops over time with the degree of global warming. And there's one important finding, is that in the past we've been too conservative in how we have assessed our the risk levels ahead of us for the different sectors. And these are summarizing categories like unique systems or extreme weather events or global aggregate impacts like ice shelf collapse. And you see that the risk thresholds now, with respect to when it goes into high risk, are occurring at lower temperatures, emphasizing lower degrees of warming, emphasizing the need to keep global warming close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if we look across ecosystems, compare land-based systems and ocean or coastal systems, and the related processes involved in challenging ecosystem functionality, and here you see the 1.5 line, then you see again that for different sectors like wildfire risk, permafrost degradation, biodiversity loss, dryland water scarcity, tree mortality, carbon loss on land, actually the risk thresholds are quite close to 1.5. Whereas in the ocean, for some of them, salt marshes, seagrass meadows, kelp forest, there seems to be a little bit of a safety margin. And this difference can be explained by the degree of warming, which is higher over land than in the ocean, but both systems have been calibrated back to the global mean temperature change. But there's one system in the ocean that is especially under threat and already under pressure beyond its tipping point, and that these are the warm water coral reefs, which is a special aggregation of animals and unicellular plants that provide them with energy. And that system is disintegrating already at current degrees of warming and will disintegrate even more with further warming, losing, and the projection is we will lose 70 to 90% of them even under 1.5. And we are approaching a situation that the planet has had during Earth's history as well, when it was virtually free of coral reefs. This means the species will not go extinct, but the system, the large-scale system that is maintaining livelihoods and fisheries and coastal protection currently, may actually be lost with progressive climate change. The same is true for coastal challenges. And again, the 1.5 line indicates that atoll islands, Arctic communities are actually going into high risk once temperature is going towards 1.5 and beyond. And that is due to the degree of sea level rise that is shown on this side. And that degree depends on the degree of global warming. There are some places that are better off, large tropical agricultural deltas or resource-rich coastal cities, where risk can actually be reduced by adaptation, as you see on the right-hand side here, whereas adaptation capacity is limited, very limited for the vulnerable places. So again, this is a challenge and indicates that it's important to limit warming close to 1.5. And this clearly involves a rapid and engaged action and in deep emissions reduction. And I refer, just showing you this figure, refer to the talk by Skea, who will tell us in detail how this can be done. What Working Group 2 is doing, we have been integrating, and this reflects our efforts together with Working Group 3 in this context as well, sustainable development and climate resilient development into an overarching picture of the development trajectory that humankind would wish to go for. And looking at the climate changes, there's one key message. There's a rapidly narrowing time window of opportunity to enable higher climate resilient development. And looking at this a little bit in more detail, what this means is we should be going for a world with low emissions, system transitions, enabling that transformation, reducing climate risk, and implementing equity and justice and sustainable development achievement. And the greenish line here indicates the trajectory we could take from now onward if we manage to keep global warming to 1.5. If not, if we go beyond, it may be one of these intermediate or lower trajectories where we have certainly negative consequences, at least in some parts of the world. Certainly, our future is decided now. All aspects of life would change when we go into avoiding greenhouse gas emissions and minimizing climate risks. It seems worth doing it for everybody's well-being in the future and for our capacity to adapt to the climate change that is already happening. There are preconditions, conditions that enable individual and collective actions, which include inclusive governance, diverse knowledge systems, finance, innovation, ecosystem stewardship, and synergies between climate and development action, and behavioral change at virtually all levels from policy to society. There are conditions that constrain, that need to be worked upon, which include poverty, inequity, injustice, economic, institutional, social, and capacity barriers, siloed approaches especially, which is kind of typifying our current approaches in many instances, lack of finance and barriers to finance flows and technologies, and trade-offs with the sustainable development goals. Societal and political will and transitions are required to accelerate climate action. Our reports bring forward options to act and talk about their feasibility. I'm emphasizing adaptation, but the report lists adaptation and mitigation together, emphasizing that adaptation often has synergies with mitigation and vice versa. And these options are available for many sectors, for infrastructure, for the human health system, for society, livelihood, and economy, and also for ecosystems. So we can do something and should feel motivated in order to go for a better future than is currently projected under climate change. This includes ecosystem stewardship, and this is from a workshop report that IPCC and IPBES have produced for the first time, where they have proposed to go for a mosaic approach of neighboring protected spaces, sustainably used spaces, and intensively used spaces like cities and so forth, where still biodiversity could find its place, and where a sustainably implemented policy to protect and restore 30 to 50% of fresh water, land, and ocean ecosystems can help a condition that we call planetary health, and that would be also providing healthy conditions for the human species to survive. The overarching message is that the science is very clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing time window to secure a livable future for all. Our reports offer solutions to the world. However, it is very clear it is getting late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hans. That was super clear, and there's no doubt that science cannot be clearer, and it's so simple as well. Such a stark warning, and clearly pointing towards narrowing window of opportunity, and especially saying that how every decision counts. I'm sure when Tasneem speaks, she will also pick up on how, as CAN, we're working on bringing the issues of poverty, inequality, and injustice together, which you presented in one of your slides. I know there must be a lot of questions and comments, so I would request everybody to post your questions in the Q&A section. And your presentation also links very well with what Jim is going to cover on mitigation. As we also say, it's about the continuum of climate action. So really so important for us to stay below 1.5. Jim, over to you to talk us through the IPCC analysis on mitigation.
Yeah, okay, sure. Thanks very much, Harjeet, and I hope my screen is visible now. Just to say, this is described as a discussion with authors, and certainly Hans and I are listed as authors of the report, but I wanted to flag up the 6 heroes that got the synthesis report together. There were 6 section facilitators: Aditi Mukherjee, Peter Thorne, Gerhard Krinner, Kate Calvin, Chris Tresos from South Africa, and Deepak Dasgupta. And these were the guys who were the dynamos in the engine that really got through the synthesis report under difficult circumstances. Now, just to say directly to follow up on Hans's presentation, one of the very strong message we wanted to get across in the mitigation contribution to the synthesis report was the fact that the human beings have agency over their own future, that there are actions available to us that, if taken now and taken promptly, can take us in the direction that Hans was pointing towards. So what Shukla and I, my fellow co-chair from India, were trying to do with the mitigation contribution, we were trying to emphasize the location of mitigation action within the wider context of sustainable development. More than any other IPCC report previously, we wanted to emphasize the importance of people, human behavior, the contribution of the social sciences, and the demand side. And can I just say, this is the cover of the Working Group 3 report, and it's the first ever Working Group 3 report to have a human being on the cover, which we thought was quite an important advance. And finally, we wanted to emphasize the issue of near-term action is needed to get us moving in the right direction. So if my screen will move. So just to say, the synthesis report overall had a narrative to it that's very much like the Talanoa dialogue. It's where we are now, the current status, where we want to go in terms of long-term climate and development futures, and how do we get there in terms of near-term responses. So what I'm going to do very simply is just go through these 3 steps, and I'm going to illustrate my comments with all of the figures from the longer report of the longer version of the synthesis report. So starting with current status and trends, and this will be a few depressing slides at the beginning. This is showing clearly that we're not in the right direction at all in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. With a perspective back to 1850, this shows very clearly the huge contribution of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels and industry as a contributor to concentrations in the atmosphere, and also growing contributions from greenhouse gas emissions other than carbon dioxide. If we close in on the more recent period since 1990, this shows the development of greenhouse gas emissions since this time, a continuing growing upward trend. One of the messages from the report was that the rate of growth was lower after 2010 than it was between the year 2000 and 2010. I have to say, looking at this figure, I would have messaged it quite slightly differently and said that emissions growth paused in the middle of the last decade, but has since then resumed at the similar growth rate, which is typically about 2% per year overall. I won't go into the detail of the different regional contributions. This is going to be the subject of a later slide. But just to say, 2 very clear pictures: emissions are still on the way up. We might have bent the trend a bit, but emissions are not on the downward path that they need to be on. Okay, now the other thing is the question of where we stand in relation to carbon budgets. So there's a slightly complicated diagram. The grey bar at the top shows historical anthropogenic emissions since 1850. The top green bit is the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees at a 50% probability, 500 gigatons of CO2. And the next green bar shows the carbon budget for 2 degrees with an 83% probability. Now, what this shows very clearly, if we take carbon dioxide emissions at their 2019 level and assume they remain constant out to 2030, we have pretty much exhausted the 1.5 degrees budget. Slightly more even worryingly, if you take the lifetime emissions from current fossil fuel infrastructure, that will take you over the 1.5 carbon budget. And if you add planned fossil fuel infrastructure, then the challenge is even larger. And this is sending quite a clear message that not all of the fossil fuel infrastructure we have now can be used as originally planned if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So a very strong message there about carbon budgets with respect to where we stand at the moment. Another negative one is obviously the issue, where have we got to in terms of nationally determined contributions submitted by countries under the UNFCCC? And basically that would, according to our estimates, lead to a slight decrease in emissions compared with current levels by 2030, but nowhere near enough to hit the blue band here, which is the pathway you would need to be on in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with that 50% probability. That would require a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030 compared with 2019. We're not even on a pathway to limiting warmings to 2.5 degrees with a 2/3 probability. And it's slightly even more depressing because, of course, the implemented policies on the ground don't add up to the achievement of the nationally determined contributions. If currently implemented policies were to continue, it's the salmon-shaded line at the top that shows where we're going. Constant emissions are perhaps slightly decreasing. If we carry on with the NDCs, it makes it very likely that warming is going to exceed 1.5 degrees. However, if we continue with the NDCs, it is possible to pull it back to 2 degrees, but only by much accelerated action after the year 2030, a much steeper reduction in emissions. Right, just 2 more depressing slides to go. This one is on the subject of equity, which was a topic to which we gave much more prominence in this report, perhaps, than in previous reports. So what we have done here is, for a set of regions around the world, on the left-hand side, we have looked at historic carbon dioxide emissions per region, clearly showing that North America and Europe together account for about 40% of cumulative emissions since 1850. And other parts of the world, but look particularly at Southern Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia and Pacific. If you look only at the fossil fuel and industry component, we are looking at around 2% of historical emissions since 1850, compared to that approximately 40% from North America and Europe. If we move to the right-hand side of this figure, this is moving from carbon dioxide to total greenhouse gas emissions, so bringing in methane, nitrous oxide as well. This is showing how per capita emissions currently are distributed by region. So we've got North America at nearly 20 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita, Southern Asia and Africa down around 2 or 3 tons per capita, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. So a very uneven distribution of emissions there. The other factor that's often picked up is that for Latin America and the Caribbean, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and Africa, a lot of the emissions are associated with CO2 from land use change and forestry. Their fossil fuel related carbon dioxide emissions are in fact much lower. So big and very clear messages, we think, from the report about the equity of the distribution of emissions globally. One of the synthetic elements that came out of the synthesis report was where we tried to put Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 insights together. So the horizontal axis shows emissions per capita from 180 countries, and the vertical axis shows vulnerability per capita in these countries. And there's a very clear message here that those who've contributed least to climate change are the most vulnerable. And that's a final, very, very strong message about equity issues. Now, to be slightly more positive about things, we also looked back in terms of where we are now to think about where we are actually making some progress, and very clear messages that renewable electricity generation in particular has really improved in terms of price competitiveness and market share since the last IPCC reports in 2014. So we can see massive reductions in the cost of solar energy and wind energy to the point that they can now compete with fossil fuels in electricity markets. So that's the blue pictures at the top. And we can also see that market adoption of the technologies has gone up, extraordinary rates of growth. And we have now got to the point that wind and solar together account for about 10% of electricity generation globally. Of course, it's not enough. We need to continue these growth rates, but it's really remarkable progress. And something else that we flagged in terms of where we've got to is that it doesn't lend itself to a graphical picture, but there have been huge developments in the prevalence of laws and policies globally targeted specifically at climate change. A very large proportion of global emissions are now covered by some kind of law or policy, and a smaller proportion are covered by some kind of carbon pricing mechanism, whether it is a carbon tax or emissions trading. But just to say in parenthesis, previous IPCC mitigation reports really focused on carbon pricing as the mitigation policy instrument of choice. We tried to present a much wider picture, the importance of regulations, information, other kinds of approaches in the AR6 report. So broadly, it's still that depressing picture that Hans painted, but there are signs of progress that are actually beginning to emerge. Now, looking to the long-term future, these two graphs show the typical kind of trajectories that you would need to follow to limit warming to 1.5 degrees on the left-hand side and 2 degrees with a 67% probability on the right-hand side. And I think the key point that comes out this one is the timing of net zero. Globally, we would need to see carbon dioxide emissions reaching net zero by around 2050 in the 1.5 scenarios, moving it out into the 2060s if warming were to be limited to 2 degrees with that 67% probability. The purple curves throw CO2 only, the blue curves throw all greenhouse gases, and it makes the very obvious point that net zero greenhouse gases anticipated in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, that net zero would take place at a rather later date than net zero for carbon dioxide. In fact, in the 1.5 degrees scenarios, net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the middle of the range is someplace very close to the year 2100. And for 2 degrees scenarios, most of the scenarios, in fact, don't reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions within the 21st century at all. So that's a kind of messages on the timing. And one other message on the timing, which is really taking us into the action agenda, is that in the scenarios assessed by IPCC, and just a reminder that IPCC doesn't have its own scenarios, we can only assess scenarios that are out there in the literature. They're generally based on trying to minimize global least costs, and this carries implications for how soon net zero is reached in different sectors. So if we start to look at this sectoral division, we find that land use and land use change would go to net zero by about 2030. It's the first overall sector to reach net zero in these scenarios. It's followed by energy supply, including electricity, and especially electricity, which would need to get to net zero by around 2040. And that's compared with an aggregate net zero of about 2050. And then demand side, transport, industry and buildings, it tends to be a much slower progress. And in fact, in the most of these scenarios, they do not reach net zero CO2 emissions at any point in the 21st century, though they might be getting quite close. So it's making a strong point that at net zero, there will be some positive emissions, there will be some removals from the atmosphere to compensate these, and these will not physically be the same in each individual sector. Now, I wanted now, just in the final section, just to move on to kind of the near-term responses and some of the important messages we have here. And just to say, this is echoing a figure that Hans has shown already, where we tried to take various systems like energy supply, land, water and food, settlements and infrastructure, health and society, livelihood and economy, and try to look at what the options were for adaptation and mitigation, but do it in a kind of consistent kind of way. Now, that's far too much detail to show on one slide, so like Hans, I will actually move it down to more specifics. And what we did for the mitigation part of it was to look at the potential for emission reductions by the year 2030 in the near term and divide it up according to the costs of the different measures. And what I want to flag up really, if you see blue bars here, it means that the measures pay for themselves. There will actually be a benefit, quite apart from the climate benefits, in terms of implementing these measures. And for the energy supply sector, which is the bit at the top, the potential is absolutely dominated by solar and wind as the key options. They're important, and most of that potential is available at below zero cost. It pays for itself effectively. The other options you see down there are methane, reducing methane from fossil fuel systems. That's the third biggest one, and a variety of other options that were in the assessed literature that may cause horror on this in this particular event, including bioelectricity, geothermal hydropower, nuclear, carbon capture and storage with fossil fuels. The agriculture, forestry and land use sector also is a huge potential, and as with Hans's presentation, the reduced conversion of natural ecosystems, carbon sequestration in agriculture, ecosystem restoration, including afforestation, reforestation, are part of that picture. We also have the shift to sustainable, healthy diets in there. We don't have any costs associated with it because it's uncostable. It's a change in preferences to which we can allocate a cost. So just to say, there are things available immediately that we can really get on with. And the same applies in the demand sectors. We have buildings and transportation in the top part of the picture. So efficiency in buildings, fuel efficient vehicles, electric vehicles, appliances, the usual kind of things we've been talking about through IPCC reports in past cycles all have an important role to play. I guess the one that we would pick out here that has not been there previously is avoided demand for energy services. And the bottom end of the picture here is talking specifically about the potential in industry. So a much more technologically focused one with the biggest potential, including fuel switching there, which includes electrification, moving from coal to natural gas, potentially use of hydrogen as well are in there. But both energy efficiency and material efficiency are in there as part of the picture. Now, one thing that I wanted to flag, and I should say this diagram is not in the synthesis report. There was a version of it in the synthesis report, but we actually think the Working Group 3 version is much clearer. And it's taking a 2050 kind of time horizon, particularly on the capacity for demand reduction in emissions on the demand side, which was a new source of attention for Working Group 3. We had a complete chapter on consumption and human behaviour, which was for a first for an IPCC Working Group 3 report. So we were looking at different services, well-being services that human beings need, nutrition on the left-hand side, moving on to manufactured products, mobility and shelter as we move from left to right. And we're looking at the capacity of different types of measures and approaches to actually reduce emissions on a 2050 timescale. So the blue part refers to socio-cultural factors, the orange part to infrastructure use, and the yellow part end-use technology adoption. And the sum of it is, to put it in the headline, that in the end-use sectors, and I should say this excludes industry and manufactured products, the potential for emission reduction by demand-side measures alone is somewhere between 40 to 70% of current emissions. And that, is a genuinely impressive thing. And we can really demonstrate that taking up these measures also contributes to human well-being. It's not sacrifice, it's about improving quality of life and well-being at the same time. I've got two more pictures that I want to show. The first one is on the question of the link between adaptation and mitigation options and their take-up and their links to the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a mixture of mitigation and adaptation in this, but I want to flag up the big message that there are far more synergies than trade-offs with the Sustainable Development Goals more broadly. This is a really important point, and we can emphasize factors like improvements in air quality that go along with climate change mitigation. And some of the benefits may in fact be bigger for people than some of the climate benefits just from moving on air quality. We do need to be careful with the orange part here, where it's a little bit ambiguous. And I did want to flag up, for example, that in terms of land use, there are potential trade-offs with issues like food availability, food security, which is where these orange bits are coming up, and some of the other SDGs as well. So we need to watch that. That may be associated with the use of land for bioenergy, for example, is one of the things that fall out there. I see Harjeet's turned on his camera. That's his hint that I should draw it all to a close thing. I'm taking the hint, Harjeet. Don't worry. Last slide to finish off here. This is a figure that's in the longer synthesis report by some kind of miracle, because it was not accepted as part of the Working Group 3 summary for policymakers at the approval session, but it's there in the longer report. And it's about the financial side of it and showing just the huge gap between current financial flows, which are in blue, and the grey bars, which are where we would need to be by 2030 in order to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And the big message is we're a factor of 3 to 6 out. We need to up these financial flows by that kind of factor. And the points we want to make is the gaps are actually lowest for electricity. Renewable energy is doing least badly, if I can talk about it that way. It's energy efficiency, transport, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, where are the big challenges for getting the mitigation flows going. The challenge is much bigger for developing countries than for developed countries, which is the second set of bars on this figure. I won't go through the individual reasons, but the message is clear about sectors and the importance of development there. So that was my quick zip through the mitigation relevant slides from the synthesis report. I hope it's been clear enough, because it has been an express trip, but I'll bring it to a halt there.
Thank you so much, Jim, and you got the signal, because I want to keep some space for the discussion. But I know it's not about really doing justice. With so much to be talked about and such rich reports and the work of the last few years, and drawn from thousands of scientists. It is indeed quite depressing. We've known these issues for a very long time now, with much finer analysis and details. Supply side solutions, now more on the demand side. But we know that a lot is also driven by politics or policies, or the lack of it, right? Where we still see paralysis and delaying, and as Stephan said, a lack of political will. And thank you very much also highlighting the whole issue of finance and bringing it back to where Hans started, how adaptation, mitigation are together, and then what kind of development model are we looking at and the choices that we are going to make. Okay, so I'm going to move to Lili, as you know, so she's going to be reflecting on what she heard. So she is the Deputy Director of CIEL's Climate and Energy Program. Lili, you have been following these issues for a very long time, and you were with us in Interlaken, where assessment report synthesis was being finalized, and also the submitting for policymakers. The message is very clear. The writing is on the wall. Tell us, what opportunities do we have now to influence and pressure policymakers to take ambitious actions? And also, what challenges do you see? Over to you.
Thank you, Harjeet, and thank you, Hans. Thank you, Jim, for that very comprehensive and helpful overview of the science. So I guess we now know more clearly than ever, and Hans highlighted this further, that 1.5 degree is really a survival limit for millions of people, and that real suffering is already happening now. And temperature overshoot would have catastrophic, irreversible consequences. We also know that fossil fuels are the core driver of the climate crisis. And I think Jim mentioned the words fossil fuels at least 8 times, maybe someone actually counted. We need to stay focused on what matters most, especially in the near term. And the IPCC made it clear. And Jim again highlighted that for us, that proven, readily available solutions exist and they can be rolled out. Phasing out fossil fuels, renewable energies, very important new focus, reducing energy and resource demand, and really changing our consumption and production, including our diets. And what I really want to highlight, that the summary for policymakers also helpfully makes it clear that adaptation and mitigation action that prioritizes equity, social justice, climate justice, and rights-based approaches lead to better outcomes and should be a priority for policymakers. So where that leaves us is that the fossil economy is under a threat, because those who are profiting from business as usual are now putting all efforts into greenwashing and delaying action. And their tactics have changed in the last few years. I would say that carbon capture and storage is their first line of defense. I have actually seen a couple of questions on CCS in the Q&A section. I want to really say this synthesis report highlights that the implementation of carbon capture and storage currently faces technological, economic, institutional, ecological, environmental, and social cultural barriers. And it also highlights the fact that global rates of CCS deployment are far below those in modeled pathways. And Jim, with one of his figures, also pointed to the fact that CCS is the sort of the solution with the lowest potential and the highest cost. These findings are really confirmed by real-world evidence, because most existing carbon capture and storage projects in the real world are actually enhanced oil recovery projects. So they produce more oil. They do not reduce emissions. And CCS has a decades-long history of over-promising and under-delivering, and comes with a huge energy penalty. You need to add energy when you increase the energy use if you add CCS to an already polluting facility. So despite having been around for decades, CCS facilities currently capture less than 0.1% of global emissions. It's clearly not a solution that we can count on in the critical decade ahead. And promoting it as a means to abate fossil fuels is greenwashing and misleading to the public. I'm actually curious to hear also from Jim Skea how scientists can help policymakers understand this important message in these critical years ahead. So as the fossil fuel economy is threatened by the economic viability and the competitiveness of renewable energies, again described in this report as well, the big polluters and the fossil fuel companies are really promoting carbon dioxide removal technologies as a cover-up for expanding their business. And many of these approaches depend on CCS. This is clearly not aligned with the IPCC findings, because the IPCC in its sixth assessment reports has left no doubt that irreversible impacts would come from overshooting 1.5, that there are huge physical uncertainties of doing large-scale carbon removal, and that reliance on future CDR delays deep emission cuts now. And that CDR technologies like bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture with CCS come with immense risks and harms for ecosystems and communities. And Jim also alluded to some of this. So these delay tactics that serve the interests of fossil fuel producers, they must not distract policymakers. And that's really important for when they now read this report and we take it forward, from seeing the path that is laid out in this report for them, that 1.5 is still feasible and worth fighting for, that giving up is not an option, because while it's bad now, it will get a lot worse. And it is better to fail at 1.5 than to succeed at 2 degrees, because every fraction of a degree matters. So the most ambitious mitigation pathways put out by the IPCC, and Jim hinted at some of the limitations they might have, they set the floor, not the ceiling, for necessary climate action. So there's only one conclusion, and that's a message that in the coming months, decision makers in politics, but also in the fossil fuel industry and in finance, as we've just heard, and in the business sector overall, really need to hear loud and clear that deep, immediate, sustained emission reductions through an immediate, rapid, and equitable fossil fuel phase out offer really the only viable path to limiting global warming below or close to 1.5. And we really have no time to waste with distractions, and we cannot afford new escape hatches for the fossil economy. And this message really needs to inform any government action in the critical months ahead to increase ambition in the lead up to COP28 in Dubai.
Thank you so much, Lili. That was really powerful, clear. And thank you also for picking up some of the questions. And I wanted to come to you on some of these. I think this connects very well to some of the other questions. And thank you very much, everybody, for being so active in listening and putting those questions. Jim, I'm gonna come to you to respond to some of the questions, and also building on what Lili just mentioned. There's a question: what are the top 5 actions that global companies can take for just transition, and who else can cover it? And I must also tell everybody, Jim is also chair of the 4-year Commission on Just Transition, and his first report was accepted, with very few comments in the Scottish Parliament. So you have huge body of work behind you. Please share and respond to this question. And also, if you want to say something on the CCS, and there are also a number of questions on the solar radiation modification and the dangers that geoengineering brings in. So I'm just trying to club questions. So Jim, over to you. You're muted. Please unmute yourself.
I was just going to say I could be on for the next 20 minutes addressing all these questions, Harjeet. I mean, just to say, if I can cut it down from 5 actions to maybe about 3 or something like that. I think there's a big issue in just transitions is companies looking at their supply chains, their own activities, and the labour practices that are actually employed there. That is really important, and it's also an issue for renewable energy and the question of the critical minerals, what is being called the critical mineral supply. So supply chains are important. Ensuring that if companies move into new areas, especially as they move out into fossil to renewable energy, that they make sure that they've got training for workers to make sure that these people have a passport into new kind of activities. And finally, I'll go to 3, and the last one I'm going to cheat on, because of course companies don't do it all by themselves. They need regulation and policies to make sure that they actually go in the right direction. So to save time, I've cut it from 5 to 3, but so I hope you can accept that. CCS is going to be a really interesting one, because I will say that the Chapter 6 of the Working Group 3 report on energy was actually slightly more nuanced about the status of CCS and whether it works or not. And, you know, it's just simple physics and chemistry. If we want to get to net zero CO2, we do need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And there are a variety of means of doing that that vary from the biological to the chemical, with very, very different characteristics and implications. I suspect that carbon capture and storage is going to continue to advance somewhat. Some of the biggest advances are actually being made in the Middle East rather than the the countries that many of us come from. But it should not, as Lili says, distract us from the fact, the big opportunities lie in renewable energy, and they lie in efficiency, and they lie probably in consumer behavior and some of the lifestyle factors, and we shouldn't be distracted from that.
Thank you so much, Jim. You tried to really condense it so well. Lili, can I give you just 30 seconds to quickly touch upon SRM and geoengineering very briefly before I go to Hans?
30 seconds. So solar radiation management or solar geoengineering, that is really the ultimate for solutions. I would say it is not mitigation. It is a very speculative set of proposed technological interventions into the atmosphere. The IPCC has assessed SRM. It's not included in the summary for policymakers of the synthesis for a reason, because the IPCC has concluded that we know way too little about it, but it comes with novel risks and harms for ecosystems and people. And actually, what is maybe important to note from a scientific perspective, over 400 leading scientists from around the world have signed a letter calling for a solar geoengineering non-use agreement, basically trying to put a halt to the further development of that technology and outdoor testing and potential deployment. So there's a broad scientific consensus around the dangers and risks of those approaches.
Thank you, Lili. That was quite, yeah. Jim?
Just very quickly, and to say that I think the word geoengineering only appears about 2 times in the Working Group 3 report, and it's only to say that we don't use the term geoengineering. And just to say, many of our authors couldn't bear to use the word solar radiation management and insisted on calling it solar radiation modification because of their distaste for it. You're absolutely right, it's not mitigation, and all of the references, the scoped-in references to SRM in the 3 working group reports are scattered throughout the 3 working group reports with very different dimensions. All that we were asked to do in Working Group 3 was to look at legal and ethical aspects, which we actually did on our international chapter.
Thanks a lot, Jim and Lili, to really point all the challenges and issues related to SRM and geoengineering and many of these false solutions, or what we call dangerous distractions. Hans, if I can come to you, there's a question in the chat, which is about, does the IPCC report assess for the knock-on impact of biodiversity loss at lower temperature risk, example, coral reefs, to other diversity in the oceans? And I'm going to add one more question from my side, knowing your huge body of work around oceans, and an AR6 synthesis report particularly highlights the dangers of sea level rise. So can you say a bit more, connecting these issues? How fast is that sea level rise? How does it affect you? You touched upon it in your presentation, but I think the dangers that we are going to see for hundreds of years and how it affects ecosystems, if you can elaborate a little bit on this very important issue.
Yeah, thank you. So I take this as kind of a two questions, one concerning the biodiversity patterns and the other one, the challenges coming from sea level rise. And with respect to the biodiversity patterns, what we already seeing is a biodiversity valley around the equator, which means that there is a biodiversity dip for animal diversity in the ocean already that is widening and deepening. And there is a sort of species are sort of moving out of the area, moving to higher latitudes. There is this is a major trend that is concerning biodiversity now. There are only 2 or 3 examples where actually a species is lost, where people see climate change being as a causal factor. I mean, the challenges for biodiversity from other human impacts are much larger currently, but certainly climate change is around the corner to exacerbate those patterns. In actual fact, this also connects to kind of technological view of how biodiversity is being looked at by some as a technological mean to bind and store carbon dioxide. This is an ongoing discussion in the biological research community, and the biogeochemistry of this is certainly a very interesting one. But there's one overarching message that this is not a quick fix or a quick contribution to the climate problem, because the rate of carbon uptake by all systems, even together, is far too small to compensate for the current rate of emissions. But if you bring down emissions as intended by emissions reduction, then certainly their contribution to the background and residual emissions become stronger, and they can take an important role in long-term climate stabilization. So this is a stimulus also, and it's one of the examples where adaptation and mitigation have strong synergies, where we need to reduce the degree of warming, because the warming weakens the carbon binding capacity of many ecosystems. So we are kind of shooting ourselves into our own feet if we think we can rely on those natural systems in their mitigation capacity and keep emissions going. No, that's not the choice. The choice is to cut the warming trend and then strengthen biodiversity and ecosystems for their long-term contribution to the mitigation. Now let's move to the sea level rise question. Very clearly, our special report already said that there are the challenges with respect to sea level rise towards the end of the century may not appear as challenging for the ambitious emissions reduction, but we still would get half a meter or so if we keep global warming to 1.5, but then it becomes challenging at any warming that goes beyond. And the ice masses of the planet still have a reserve of 65 meters of sea level rise available to us, depending on the extent to which we decide to continue to use fossil fuels. And certainly the immediate challenges are coming from Greenland and the West Antarctic, and there are uncertainties. But with unabated warming over the next, let's say, 2 centuries, we may well end up with sea level rise that we have had during the last interglacial, when sea level was 7 meters plus minus higher than today. And you can already imagine what this means for many coastlines, for low-lying islands and low-lying coastlines. It's an existential challenge, and considering that 1 billion people live in coastal areas, this is certainly it's a built-in risk that comes with which decision is actually currently made, and there's very little consideration of this in the current debate. So I think bringing it back and back and back in the consideration is important as a motivation to really go for ambitious mitigation.
Thank you so much, Hans. And again, I would circle back to the point that we were making, and this report makes it so clear about the continuum, not just looking at one pillar of climate action, how important mitigation is. And we have to scale up our actions on adaptation. And at the same time, we are seeing limits to adaptation, and we are seeing losses and damages, as science call it, and in political terms at UNFCCC, we call it loss and damage. And we know it has been a contentious one for years and decades, and the impacts of sea level rise is about loss and damage, which is going to continue for a very long time. And it's already a lived reality for not millions, but billions of people at 1.2 degree of global warming. And I must also say, your work and all the work that has happened in terms of advancing the issue and understanding, and of course the tireless work of civil society, and if I can say particularly Climate Action Network, to put a spotlight on the issue of loss and damage, and governments fighting for it. We've reached a point where we are now moving towards setting up funding arrangements and a fund. And I'm just back from Luxor, where the first transitional committee meeting happened. So we are seeing a bit of progress happening in that direction. So again, everything really comes together in terms of scientific analysis and political action. Okay, we are now very close to the end of our webinar. Before I do that, I want to go back to Lili, because I see so many questions related to fossil fuel industry. People are angry. They're looking at carbon budgets that was presented by Jim. They're saying, how can it happen? How can we look at, how can we just afford to see this cognitive dissonance? There is so much to say, about the politics and why things are not moving. So Lili, if you can quickly speak to that, and also your key message to policymakers and what we can do this year. And then Jim, I'm going to come to you for a 30-second last key message to policymakers, and also to you, Hans, before I hand over to Tasneem.
Thank you, Harjeet. And I'm angry too. And I think we all have the right to be angry, because of having been deceived for so long, and action having been delayed. And I think we need to take action to stop that from happening in the future. I think because global and equitable fossil fuel phase out really requires unprecedented action and collaboration. I think what we really need is a new treaty, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that many of us are calling for. That would be a good way to begin to start that global discussion on a managed phase out of fossil fuels, and also a just transition. And I'm hoping that many more governments will join the call of Pacific Island states and leaders calling for such a treaty. And when it comes to policymakers, I really think one of the places to focus is the upcoming so-called global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, which is, meant as the vehicle to correct course for governments if our ambition is not high enough. So we have that vehicle, and we need to ensure that this global stocktake results in concrete commitments by all parties to a full and equitable phase out of fossil fuels, and that it excludes any references that opens the door for dangerous distractions and false solutions. This also means that we have to ensure that this global stocktake is not a place where lobbyists come in to promote problematic technologies such as carbon capture and storage or geoengineering. And I think just pointing to that potential conflict of interest and the lobbying power of the fossil fuel industry is a key thing that basically also applies to to climate science and to the science that eventually makes it into the next IPCC report. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really sharp. Jim, and then Hans, your one key message for the policymakers.
Right. Well, my key message is really came out of the slides I was showing. We have options available for rapid and actually ambitious reductions in emissions. And not only do we have the options, we have the policy tools that are proven to work to bring these options actually into play. We know stuff that works. It just needs to be more ambitious, and the scope of the measures need to be applied more widely. And I would say outside IPCC, my experience with citizens' assemblies looking at climate change, when ordinary people get together for 5 or 6 weekends to go through these issues, they come up with something far more ambitious than politicians are willing to follow. And I would just leave it there.
People power. Okay, great. Hans.
Thank you. While Jim gets his apartment refurbished, obviously, let me just emphasize one aspect, that analogy that has been very appealing to me. Economists have been talking about rescuing a currency or rescuing a banking system or a bank, and when they do that, they implement and they give you the vision of what they would be doing, and they talk about whatever it takes. They will be doing whatever it takes to rescue a currency or a bank. Now imagine that we transfer this kind of mentality about protecting our climate and protecting our biodiversity as life-sustaining as a life-sustaining foundation of our existence on this planet. This concerns adaptation measures, mitigation measures, and as Jim says, we have loads of options available to us, considering justice and equity. And whatever it takes should be a mentality to overcome the current inertia in the implementation of those solutions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can't just keep talking about it and not doing exactly to respond to the emergency. Tasneem, over to you. Please, sorry, we squeezed that time. Last words and then wrap it up for everybody. Over to you, Tasneem.
Thank you very much, Harjeet, and greetings to everybody. Let me start out by thanking our panelists and our heroes, Hans and Jim, and Lili, thank you very much for your reflections as well. Look, I think that the message is clear, the evidence is clear, as we heard, the science is really clear. There are messages, of course, that we have heard. That's not news to us. As civil society, we have been saying these things for a very long time. The fact that we are going in the opposite direction, that the fossil fuel industry is a key driver, a major culprit in the cause of climate change, that equity and justice has to be absolutely central to the work that we do to address the climate emergency, and that time is running out. And so what we're hearing in this, through the AR6 synthesis report now, of course, is valuable, more detailed analysis and the wonderful connection now between the dots, if we can call it, the connections between mitigation and adaptation, the consequences if we don't do enough on those fronts in terms of loss and damage, the fact that we have to connect climate justice with social justice, and fundamentally, we have to push for much stronger political will. And so I just want to conclude by saying the scientists have done their work. We will continue doing our work. And as a network, we have identified, the need for us to be more and more, putting our actions on steroids, basically. The actions that we will have to take to ensure that the politicians, the industries, and all other important players are going to take this emergency seriously enough. As Hans says, they can respond very quickly to, so-called economic crises, banking, etc., even wars, and that's come up in the questions, for example, very quickly to mobilize the kind of resources to go to war when we need the climate emergency to be addressed, when we need peace. And so as a network, this year, together with many of our allies in the climate movement, we have identified escalating our actions against the fossil fuel industry as our key priority for 2023. So, the fossil fuel industry has literally declared war against people and planet. And we intend to fight back. And that's the single most important message I want to leave with all of you, because the science is clear. We have a moral and ethical responsibility for the survival of people and planet. And we all would need to do the best we can for the future of both people and planet, and to ensure justice and equity, and those most vulnerable and least responsible, that they are taken care of. So I want to thank all of the panelists again. Thank you, Harjeet, for the moderation. And I want to thank all of those who have participated in this webinar, the questions that have come through. And of course, we couldn't get through all of them, but they signal, as was said, lots of anger. And so let's turn anger and use anger for our collective power to bring across and bring about the changes that need to happen. And let's take on the fossil fuel industry as a start. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation. And Harjeet, I'm not sure if you want to just wrap things up again. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you. And Jim had to leave. He had another appointment, and he's also apologizing for the construction happening outside his home, not his home. So yeah. So thank you very much again. There are many questions about the recording and presentation. We'll be posting the recording on YouTube, on Climate Action Network's channel, and we will also have presentations on our website. And thank you very much, Hans and Jim, for sharing those presentations. And yeah, we'll be connecting, and we'll have many more such sessions. And thanks so much again, Hans, and of course Jim and Lili, to really set the context and tell us the direction that we have to take. And we'll keep inviting you for your insights and directions.
Thanks a lot to you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.